This video discusses our buyer group maintenance on TrackDrive version 2. So I go to call routing and buyer groups. Add a buyer group. Okay, now a buyer group can be used for various reasons. One reason might be that you have a client that has 5 or 6 call centers and he's having you route those calls to his different call centers based on how many agents they have. So you would group those buyers together. Another example is perhaps you have resellers using your TrackDrive system. So you create 10, 20 buyer records for them, all paused to begin with, and you give them full access to edit the buyer records to say where they're going to forward the calls to and the like. However, you put them together in a buyer group so you can create a team for that reseller to be able to maintain all the buyers in that buyer group. There's various reasons why you might create a buyer group. Another reason, as I'm going to go over here shortly, is you could be simuldialing buyers and making use of the press 1 to accept the call feature that we have in the buyer records. So I'm going to set this one up as the ABC group. And the dial behavior here is how is TrackDrive going to dial the buyers. Typically you're just saying, well, I'm just making a group, treat them like I've listed each buyer on the offer separately and dial them sequentially based on the tier and weight they have in their individual buyer record. However, we do have the ability to let you dial buyers simultaneously. In that situation, you do see the tier and weight will come up because we need to know for that group how do they line up with the rest of the buyer groups that are dialing simultaneously or individual buyers. The tier will just dial that buyer group as if it was a single buyer, but just happens to be dialing a bunch of buyers at once. Now you will want to make use of the press 1 to accept option that I've discussed in the buyer detail videos because there's always phone systems that are faster than the other phone systems. So typically someone's going to answer the phone much faster from their system and they'll get all the calls if you do it that way. So press 1 to accept. There are exceptions to that. Maybe you're calling all of your employees after hours for support and it's always going to their cell phones or their buyer records or it's agent records. Maybe the first one to answer in that situation doesn't have press 1 to accept. So that's how that functions there. I'm going to go ahead and turn off that and go to sequentially. And then I'm just going to look for the buyers that belong to ABC. So I'm going to grab that one and that one, and those are the buyers on the list. So that's what's going on there. Now we have the same capping that we have in individual buyer records. Typically the only thing you'll probably maintain in here is perhaps this guy has given us $2,000 and we're going to eat away at the rate that each buyer is set at, but we will cap that buyer when he reaches the $2,000 spent. Typically you won't set the hourly caps in the buyer group record. You'll probably set all the hourly caps and concurrency caps in the individual buyer records, but that's how that would function. Okay, so I go ahead and create this buyer group. Now we don't ask for much information on most of our maintenance screens so that you have less information to key in, but once it has the record in the system, more information is going to show up. And on the buyer group record, the main thing is this enable team access. Now I'm going to go ahead and say yes, and I'll invite okay, so I'm just going to add that and update buyer group. Now whenever you're adding teams to the system, I do know that you could go to company and teams and maintain teams there. It is much easier to maintain your team access when you're creating a new team by either adding it through the traffic source edit, the buyer edit, or the buyer group edit, depending on what you're trying to invite. That way you have less thinking to do on what you need to set and what you're trying to approve. You can always edit the team after we create the team record, but this is how we're gonna do this here. So I'm going to update that buyer group. Now when you have a buyer group, it makes the maintenance much easier because all I have to do now is in the offer, instead of listing individual buyers, I'm going to list for the routing the buyer group. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of, let's just imagine I was adding that second ABC lending. Had I not had this listed here, and I had the ABC group here, okay, they're going the buyers in this group are going to fall in as if they're listed individually and route based on their tier and weight, just like normal. And if this was a buyer group with simuldial, the tier and weight would be assigned to the group, and it would dial that group simultaneously right in line with these buyers. The reason we do these groups is it makes it easier to maintain, because now that I have the offer updated with the buyer group, as I continue to add buyers for ABC group, I just add them to the buyer group. That'll automatically make it route to the buyers in that group because I have it listed here, and because in the company record, the company menu option, on the teams, when I look at the buyer group ABC, you'll see it's already set up. It was going to Richard P. Nolan Test ABC. That's who got invited. He has access to the buyer groups. Not much stuff he can do there. He can just see. The key here is the total caps. We're going, typically the only cap you're going to have is the total. As I showed you, I put the dollar amount in, so this buyer can see how much money he has left for all the buyers that are in his group. And then down here, the buyer maintenance. You see, I don't have to list buyers here because they belong to this ABC group. Now, depending on who this buyer group is, if it was a reseller, for example, you may give him much more update access in the buyer group, in the buyer records, because you don't care where he's forwarding the calls to, you don't care about many things. So you might say, well, I'm going to let him update the name there. I'm going to let him change the time zone. I'm going to let him pause and unpause his own buyers. Not sure you'd let him have access to doing the filters, but that's up to you. You could let him change whether you record calls for that buyer or not. That'd be up to you. The viewing calls, that's fine. Tier and weight, you probably wouldn't let him change that because you don't want him to give his buyers better priority than you want to give. But you probably do want him to be able to do the total caps, monthly caps, daily caps, hourly caps, concurrency caps. Probably wouldn't let him change the conversion name. If you're doing real-time bidding, you'd let him change the prices of each individual buyer. That's no problem. Now, the conversion revenue is going to be what he's paying you, not what he's charging his buyers, so that he may want to pay you more for a call than he does. You wouldn't let him change the duration or the dedupe time frame. So if this was a reseller, you might set things this way so that he has a little more access to his buyer records. If the buyers are just a whole bunch of call centers, you'd probably just leave it that they can change their numbers on their buyers and nothing else, because you'll be maintaining their buyers. Maybe the buyer name is fine. So I'm going to update that team. So that's how the buyer groups work and what they're used for. In summary, it makes it easier to maintain your offer in your buyer group as you have someone that keeps adding buyers, because once that's in the offer and in the buyer group team permissions, adding buyers to the group will handle both the offer and the team permissions.